Hello everyone, welcome back. It is time to get ready to hear one of God's stories. Our story today is called Kings in the Promised Land. To hear a story from God's holy book, I close my mouth, just listen and look. After rescuing his people from slavery in Egypt and bringing them through the Red Sea, God led the Israelites deep into the desert. After about a year of teaching his people how to live as God's people, God decided it was finally time to bring them into the land he promised them. But God's people were afraid. They saw the land God wanted to give them, and they decided not to follow God's lead, and so they had wandered in the desert. On and on and on they went for 40 years. But after 40 years, God kept his promise to their children, and he gave them the land just as he promised. Here's what happened. God led the Israelites right up to the edge of the Jordan River and told them what to do. The priests went first carrying the Ark of the Lord. They took one step into the water, and the waters pulled back and parted just like it had at the Red Sea. God's people walked on dry land right into the land God promised them. There were enemies in the land, and God's people had to fight to take possession of it. But as the people trusted in the Lord, he gave them victory over their enemies, and there was peace in the land. God's people were finally in God's place, living under his blessing, with him as their king. God ruled over his people with goodness and love. He watched over them and fought for them and kept them safe. God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob long ago that one day one of their descendants in the line of Judah would be king. God's chosen king would rule under God, keeping his commands and doing what was right. But the people decided they didn't want to wait for God's chosen king. No, they said. We want a king now, and we want a king just like every other nation has. God was sad. He could see that his people did not want him to be their king. They wanted someone else to rule over them instead of God. But even though God was sad, he gave them what they wanted. The people chose someone handsome and tall. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But just as God warned them, it didn't work out very well. King Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. God empowered him to lead his people, but it didn't take long before Saul thought he was in charge, and he started to do whatever he wanted to do. Saul didn't love God or love God's people the way he was supposed to, and that meant a lot of trouble for God's people. But God did not give up on his people or on the promise he had made to give them a king, one that would rule under him, a king who would seek him and obey him and help the people to do the same. So when God chose Israel's second king, it worked out much, much better. God chose a shepherd boy named David, a man from the line of Judah. Why did God choose this man? Because he had a heart that loved God and loved people. David was a good king. He was God's chosen king, and he ruled under God, keeping the Lord's commands and doing what was right. David perfect? No. The Bible says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." Romans 2:23. Although David was not perfect, he wanted to follow God's way. So when he sinned, David turned to the Lord and cried out to him for help, and the Lord forgave him and blessed him. In this way, David ruled under God and was a good king. But even though David was a good king, he didn't have the power to save himself or his people from sin. God's people needed an even greater king. They needed someone who would mend their broken relationship with God by taking away sin forever. Can you mend your broken relationship with God? No. I have no power to save myself. Only God can save me. And that's just the kind of king that God had planned on sending them, right from the very beginning. One who would be perfect, who would keep all of God's commands all of the time. One who would always do what was right and always follow God's way. He would be the one to save us all from sin and mend our broken relationship with God. I bet you know who that greater king is. I wonder how Jesus is different from David. I wonder why Jesus is the only one who can change our hearts. Thank you for listening to another one of God's stories. I hope you enjoyed our story today, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.